Hi, I'm Jeff Ray, your host for Economic Outlook. Welcome to our show, where each week we take a deep dive into the regional economy and the people, the companies, the communities, and the projects that are helping our region grow. The global pandemic and the economic crisis that followed has left a lasting impact on nearly every industry, perhaps none more impacted than the commercial and industrial real estate markets. We'll take a closer look at those markets in the pandemic economy and talk about how they're poised to rebound coming up on Economic Outlook. The pandemic has caused a shift in people's shopping and dining habits and has forced companies to work remotely instead of in person. Those things have impacted the commercial and industrial real estate markets in a negative way, but will those impacts last? We're sitting down today for a conversation about real estate in a pandemic economy. Please join me in welcoming Tim Mehal, Vice President of Retail Services and Principal at NAI Cressey, Joe Grable with Berkshire Hathaway Commercial Services, and Jeremy McClements, the Vice President at the Bradley Company. Just one other note before we get started here at WNIT, we're respecting social distancing and as such, have both our host and our guests joining us virtually instead of in person. Gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Well, appreciate having you back. We obviously have a different conversation than we've had in the past. We've really enjoyed the chance to get inside your brains in the past and talk about real estate a little bit. And obviously with the pandemic, a lot of things changing. And so I want to really focus on that today. I want to start maybe, Joe, with you and let's go back in time, hop in a time machine with me, go back pre-pandemic, talk a little bit about what's happening in the real estate markets before the pandemic hit.
Yeah, so from my perspective, it was full throttle, right? All the markets, office, retail, and industrial were performing pretty strongly. So strongly, in fact, that it felt a little bit like a sugar high. The market was performing really, really well, kind of across the board, in my experience. And the future looked so bright, you had to wear shades.
All right. And Jeremy, let me come your way too. Let's start. You do a lot with warehouse, industrial, some of those things. Tell us what was going on in that space prior to pandemic hitting.
I mean, prior to the pandemic, the space was moving really, really well. And honestly, none of that really changed with the pandemic. It slowed down. It definitely slowed down for a couple months. But we really didn't slow down in terms of our business. We did more business last year than the year before and the year before that. So everything has kind of continued to grow. The issue is obviously availability of space. And that's been a problem before the pandemic. And then even after the pandemic, is just having the space available.
Great. Thanks, Jeremy. And Tim, let me come your way. You spend a lot of time in the commercial real estate, side of things, retail. Talk a little bit about those markets, kind of what was happening here in our region, both Michigan and Indiana, prior to the pandemic.
Well, as Joe described, it was a pretty robust market. The demand for space had already started to shift from larger spaces to maybe smaller multi-tenant shared buildings. So that's where we saw the bulk of the development that was going on in whether it was, St. Joe County or Southwest Michigan. A lot of restaurant activity. There was a fair amount of banking activity. But the shift had already been on away from larger spaces to much smaller, more prominent, out in front kind of spaces. Great.
So last March, the pandemic hits and we start to see impacts really on all industries, businesses, kind of the forced, government shutdowns, offices go to virtual and such, many things are closed. So let's walk through this last year a little bit and maybe talk about some of those industries and how they've been impacted, especially maybe Tim, I'm going to stay with you for a second and to talk a little bit about, kind of some of those forward front retail, commercial restaurant, kind of spaces. And I feel like because of traffic, those were impacted the most.
They may have been, the market took a real pause there for a little while, for a couple of months. But most of my, I shouldn't say most, a good part of my activity over the course of the last, 8 or 9 months has been, oddly enough, restaurants. We've had some people exit the market that may have been, suffering before, and the pandemic was just sort of the final nail. But there have been people coming in right behind them to take some of those spaces. activity is up substantially. If you've got a drive-through, you know, and not much of a dining room, but if you've got a drive-through in a pretty good location, it's really high demand. We're seeing a shift. We were seeing a little bit of it before, but even more so now. We're seeing a shift in uses. The straight up retail uses, whether it's clothing or shoes or, you know, the kind of things you can get online. The demand is down for brick and mortar on that stuff to a degree, but people are coming in with interest for alternative uses, whether it's medical or services you can't get on the internet, personal services that you've got to go out for. So there's a lot of activity there right now as well.
Great. Joe, take us inside, you know, the minds of some of your clients over the last, you know, couple months. They're wrestling with these shutdowns, the closures. You know, some of them are obviously thinking about, you know, do I stay? Do I go? Do I grow? Those kind of things. Give us, you know, maybe some of that insight from your clients during that time period.
Sure. Well, starting with retail and in particular restaurants, that's an industry that was essentially decimated by the coronavirus. I think Tim spoke to it. A number of the weaker players, in particular in the casual dining segment, where sit down was the primary component, it really accelerated maybe things that were inevitable. But we saw TGI Fridays and Applebee's, large, well-capitalized chains, close stores, and lots of sit-down restaurants that were mom and pop operations just go out of business, period. And although I think the early PPP loans and EIDL loans were well-intentioned, the rollout of that was so clunky that for the smaller, less capitalized operators, they were out of business before the aid showed up. So that was a really difficult transition. Interestingly, here we are a year later, and Tim's absolutely right. A number of those boxes that went dark quickly, we've already got demand for those restaurant spaces. And the real winners in this have been the folks with predominantly carry out delivery type models. So I would be really surprised if there's a pizza store in St. Joe County that lost money last year, whether they're branded or unbranded. The same thing for the delivery sandwich shops and other folks that have a large delivery component. And we've seen a big growth in our market of some of the delivery services like Grubhub and the likes, incredibly popular right now. On the office side, there's been a pretty radical transformation. Lots of folks that are working virtually, and that's beginning to trigger serious questions about if I've been functioning reasonably well for 6, 9, 12 months, do I really need that office space at all? Can I work 100% virtually? I suspect the answer is no, that folks will discover that over the long haul, but it's certainly a temptation. You get to ditch a whole bunch of overhead right up front. So there are lots of businesses evaluating that as a change in the business model.
Jeremy, I'll come your way to continue that office discussion. Your company obviously plays in that space quite a bit as well too. What kind of observations from your office customers about not only navigating the last year, but sort of the path forward?
I think, you know, everybody, just like the guys are mentioning, everybody's looking at the entire picture of their office right now and what that looks like going forward in the future, and definitely right sizing what that looks like. So while that market was a little bit slow, like everything else at the very beginning of the pandemic, there's a lot more activity within the market right now with companies trying to figure out sizing and what they're going to look like moving forward. So, you know, our company is a great example of that. I come into the office occasionally if I need to get things done, but I don't need to be in the office. And so everybody's taking a hard look at what that is and it looks like for their business and their company, and trying to figure out what the plan is moving forward. I think, you know, keeping social distancing in mind and what that looks like with your employees is a really big deal, but also access and IT support and what all that looks like on the office side. So everything's changing with Zoom and with Teams and all these different opportunities that we have to be remote. But at the same time, there's something to be said for getting into the office. And so I think it's more just a right sizing that's happening right now, and activity still remains strong. Certain segments and areas like downtown has a little bit more vacancy rate than usual. And so everybody's just trying to figure out what that looks like right now.
Joe, I want to come back your way for a second, more of a, let's call it global perspective, or maybe not global, but let's call it United States perspective. And so it seemed to be pre-pandemic, there was some trends to for larger urban areas, that there was a lot of growth and development happening there. The pandemic seems to have have some people thinking whether they want to be in those urban areas. Are there national trends that we should be able to take advantage post pandemic? Did this teach companies lessons that they'll learn about kind of where they want to locate based on big cities versus smaller, more rural? Help us understand any lessons learned there.
Yeah, unquestionably in my mind, and there's been a lot of press around this, the urban centers had created incredible demand. I'm talking here about New York, San Francisco, the Bay Area, Chicago, what have you. And I think a combination of the pandemic, already existing very high housing prices, and then also in some cases some civil unrest like what we saw in downtown Chicago. It absolutely made people think twice. If you don't get any of the amenities like the restaurants and the ability to go to plays or opera or what have you, if you don't have availability of any of those things, I think some people are asking themselves, why am I paying $4,000 a month in rent? Right? When I could be back home in South Bend, Indiana, renting for $800 or $1,000 a month. And I've witnessed that firsthand where tenants of mine have relocated from LA or New York City. And of course, they had connections already in the area, but they made a decision that they were unwilling to pay that kind of a premium for that kind of a life experience. And so I think at least in the short term or short to intermediate term, there is going to be a flight from some of these really expensive places. Over the long haul, I still think New York City and the Bay Area, will have compelling value propositions. But in the short to intermediate term, there's no question our area, our region is going to benefit from folks moving back to the Midwest.
Jeremy, I want to talk back to industrial a second. You said things had been really good this last year. Obviously, early on the pandemic, supply chains had been interrupted. Companies had shut down. Much like Joe was talking about, has the pandemic taught us certain lessons in the warehousing distribution? Are there advantages to being here that they weren't quite as clear pre-pandemic, but might have been exaggerated by impacts during the pandemic?
Absolutely. I think, the biggest issue during the pandemic was that a lot of manufacturers shut down for 8 weeks, 8 to 10 weeks they were shut down. And when they're shut down, they can't make product. And so then you run into supply chain issues. And I think people are really looking at their supply chain right now and what that looks like, whether they're getting their product from across the United States or they're getting their product from overseas. Everybody experienced delays there, which impacted what they were able to manufacture and what they were able to do when it kicked back on. The RV industry is a great example of that. Those guys had to shut down for 8 weeks. And during that time, everybody was really getting sick of being at home inside their house with their kids. So they wanted to get outside. They wanted to get in RVs. And they started buying up those dealer units that were on lots already, but they weren't able to make ones to backfill those units. And so they ran into a couple month delay in terms of getting their product out the door. And then the suppliers had the same issue. So they couldn't get their products from overseas or they couldn't get their products from other places. And it just created a gigantic problem. So I think a lot of people are looking at the total supply chain for their business and how it works and operates. And the Amazon effect of what we've even seen locally here, Amazon coming here, Amazon going to Fort Wayne, Amazon doing another 1 million square feet in Fort Wayne. These big box distribution centers are going to keep growing and they're going to keep going. And some of that's going to maybe look like taller buildings, even taller than what we're seeing on the northwest side of town, potentially for some of those larger players. But it's also going to look like this is a great spot to be in to get access to 3/4 of the United States in a day's drive time. This is a great spot to be from a distribution standpoint, and companies are realizing that. And the other piece, I guess, to target onto that as well is just labor. The unemployment rate in the state is right at around 5%, or even here locally, it's under 4%. And that's a big deal. So if you're having a hard time staffing and you're trying to ramp production up or you're trying to bring in more distribution jobs, you need to be in a location where the cost of living is good, like Joe mentioned, but also where there's amenities, where you can get outside, where you can go to a park and where you don't feel like you're stuck in a downtown apartment or somewhere far away from here. So, that's just a few thoughts on that.
Great, Tim, I want to come your way. Jeremy mentioned the Amazon effect, and obviously there's a lot of thought that has influenced retail. I think, I feel like every year the media does some story about it. Are these retail districts dead? Is everybody going to buy everything online? Will them all, survive, different things. So talk a little bit about just sort of the trends there, and even lessons that we might have learned on the retail side going forward that maybe position us to continue to have those vibrant commercial areas.
Well, there's not a whole lot of question that it's not going away. And this huge uptick that we've seen during the pandemic isn't necessarily going to roll back. It takes a lot to change consumer patterns and habits and so on. And once it starts to head off in this direction, and whether it's Amazon or anybody else, that's the way it's going to kind of keep going. We've never been a market. I don't think we've ever been a market that's necessarily been overstored.
Mm-hmm.
There are areas of Chicago that I think are going to suffer much worse than we will from a vacancy or reuse perspective. The mall is like University Park, for instance. It's just too big of an asset to go away. It's too big of an anchor for the region for it to go away. I can see the Sears parcel, the entire 16-acre parcel, however big it is, being completely redeveloped, for a multi-use kind of a deal. There may be some multifamily aspect to it. I don't know this, but I can see a multifamily aspect to it. Still entertainment can still be a big a component to something like that, but it's going to be, it's not going to be another department store. That's because department stores were on their way out or suffering anyway. And, the pandemic really is just it's going to be a pretty seismic shift in the long-term way some of these assets are going to be used. It's not going away. It'll be repurposed and reused.
Yeah, if I could just follow that on. Tim was talking about the retail disruption, and I think traditionally everybody has thought that the service industry is pretty well immune from those same trends. It's pretty hard to get a haircut by Amazon, right? But what's happened though is the profitability of those stores has absolutely been impacted by the pandemic and changing buying patterns. So what happens is when people don't get a haircut for 8 weeks or 10 weeks, they may be inclined to get a haircut less frequently going forward. And I think same store sales, even now, are significantly trailing what they used to be. The other thing is in the hair salon industry, again, an industry you would think would be totally unimpacted by the internet. Product sales, the mousse or the shampoo or what have you, that's a significant component of those stores' profitability. And folks have shifted their buying patterns, and as a result, those chains are selling significantly less product because now people are ordering that product online instead of getting it from their salon. And that's not true just for the quick service chains, but even the high-end salons are selling less high-end product because people have gotten in the habit of buying their product online as a result of the past year. So sometimes there can be completely unanticipated shifts to even service businesses and their business model. So maybe a haircut gets more expensive. I'm still not going to get my haircut on Amazon, but the revenue model is going to have to change for them. And some of those tenants will have to change their revenue model, or they're not going to be able to afford the rents they've been paying in the past.
Let's shift a second and talk downtowns in particular. It seems, pre-pandemic, we had some nice success, whether it was, Goshen or Elkhart or South Bend or Mishawaka or Niles or Buchanan. There were a lot of Plymouth, a lot of great activities happening in the downtown here in our region, whether that be, restaurant or office or different things. I think people are really interested in their center city and what's happening. Any post-pandemic trends? Will some of that downtown interest remain strong, or are there things that we should worry about in the downtown area?
Tim, do you want to speak to that?
I was going to say, who wants to jump on that one? As long as the residential patterns, I think, as long as the residential patterns keep keep shifting and keep focusing in downtowns. The need for the services and the need for the amenities, I think is going to continue to be there. I've been in, over the course of the last couple of days, I've been in downtown LaPorte, downtown Goshen, downtown Plymouth. Don't ask me why, but I've been in a lot of these smaller downtowns, and the traffic is still just huge. I mean, there's still plenty of activity, and there's still things going on. Now, I'm not sure if it was just a lot of passing through traffic, that kind of thing, but they were busy. There was a lot of people in those downtowns.
Yep. I agree. I think the future of downtowns are bright as long as communities continue to understand the importance of amenities in those downtowns. We've seen in South Bend and Mishawaka. In Mishawaka, I'm doubling down on the downtown. I really believe in it. I think they're doing great things with the parks, and I think people want to be there. In the late 70s, early 80s, there was a big question: are the malls in America going to completely empty out the downtowns and kill those downtowns? And at first, it kind of seemed like they might. But I think over time, patterns have changed. Housing patterns have changed significantly. And I really think well-managed downtowns where the cities get it and understand the importance of a vibrant retail sector, I think they're going to continue to outperform.
Great. Jeremy, I want to come your way. We're about 4 minutes left here. So in our final 4 minutes, Jeremy, you mentioned some of the same challenges that existed pre-pandemic exist, kind of post or during the pandemic, whether it be, buildings or sites or inventory. So as we're thinking about, sort of moving forward, what are some of the things that we as a community should be doing to better prepare ourselves for those opportunities to encourage commercial or industrial office kind of development?
Well, I think the biggest thing we can do is all work together. And, that's one of the things that we found out a lot during this pandemic is that everybody's only a Zoom call away. And, sometimes when you're running day to day, like we were pre-pandemic, just chasing things left and right, you sort of miss the fact that we're all connected and we're all trying to do the same thing for our region, whether that's, North Central Indiana here or Southwest Michigan, and just looking at the big picture and how communities can work together and not compete against each other. You and I had talked a few weeks ago about the labor force and where labor is coming from St. Joe County to Elkhart County and what that looks like back and forth between the two. And I think all that's important, but it's also important to look at housing and to look at what you're doing in your, like these guys were just mentioning, the downtown core, what that looks like, amenities outside. I think focusing in on what we can do together as communities, how we can grow together as communities, and how we can be more regional focused is going to make a really big difference in setting us apart. It's going to set us apart for site selectors who are looking at these market and for companies who are looking to the market. And then just being able to tell the story about what we have to offer in this region and what we have to offer from the college standpoint, from young adults and kids and housing and our downtown areas and what the amenities that we have and how to sell those amenities. And then just the way that we can distribute and bring product from here to other places in the country and also produce it here and get it to other places in the country. And being able to talk through that is very important kind of to the growth of the future, I see.
Joe, I want to come your way, kind of follow up on that question. So what, in our last 2 minutes, what are the kind of, if there's an elected official, watching, if there are community leaders here, what are some of the things the community can be and should be doing to help the clients that you're bringing here, be ready to go?
Yeah, well, I'm going to start off by strongly seconding Jeremy's motion that a sense of regionalism should trump everything else. I really do think that when folks consider our area, they're looking at the entire area. And so more regional partnerships, I think over the long haul, is what's going to position us best. The other thing, and I know the Indiana Enterprise Center, as a for instance, has had some real bumps in terms of community buy-in and things like that. But I think at the end of the day, getting the entitlements and the zoning in place with appropriate community input is going to be really important, because the more you can get things shovel ready and eliminate barriers to potential future development, the better off our communities, all of our communities, are going to be to experience future growth. So anything that municipal entities can do to appropriately expedite those approvals and set the table for future development and be intentional about infrastructure, all of those things are huge.
Great. And Tim, I'll give you the last word on this, on the same thing. Any advice or things as a community we should be doing in our last 30 seconds here or so to really position ourselves for continued growth?
I think it's the getting the word out there and selling the community, selling the region. And I think a big way that happens is probably increasing the chamber budget, Jeff. So
Is this an envelope, Jeff?
There you go. I'm glad I gave you the last word there, Tim. It was great. Well, gentlemen, I'm grateful for you joining us today. Thank you for the good work that you're doing and selling our communities here, and we really appreciate it. This is a terrific update on what's going on, and we'll look forward to having you back in the future. People really enjoy your insight and kind of hearing about what's going on. So thank you for taking your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for our show today. Thank you for watching on WNIT or listening to our podcast. To watch this episode again or any of our past episodes, you can find Economic Outlook at WNIT.org or find our podcast on most major podcast platforms. We also encourage you to like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. I'm Jeff Ray. I'll see you next week.
This WNIT local production has been made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.